This Tuesday in Linda Green.
Linda Green?
Ricky Pinder.
He was young.
He's 18. He's only just started shaving and he still lives with his mum.
She's still single.
You're like a proper woman.
You mean I'm fat?
But if it's gonna get serious,
Fancy getting married?
Do you fancy a shag?
he'll have to meet the parents.
Compliment the food, laugh at their jokes, and for God's sake, don't mention the funny smell.
Linda Green, tomorrow at 9 on BBC One.
What do you think? Whitney dressed as Britney?
That's our Linda.
36 million years ago, the Earth's most powerful predator was making waves. Life was sweet for carnivores who crushed through bone like candy. And a horn the size of a cricket bat was perfect for knocking your enemies for 6. From a time the world forgot, Walking with Beasts continues Thursday at 8:30 on BBC One.
This is BBC One in the East. Now the news at 10 o'clock with Peter Sissons and Kim Riley.
America turns the screw on the last Taliban strongholds. Warplanes hammer Kunduz, 10,000 fighters are trapped. No deals either in Kandahar, especially for the Taliban leader. Blunkett defends his terrorism bill, but many MPs think it's rushed. Sarah Payne's mother relives the last moments she spent with her daughter.
Here in the East, not guilty. The man cleared of killing Vicky Hall says the knowledge of his own innocence kept him going. And the plane spotters imprisoned in Greece on spying charges hope to be freed tomorrow.
Good evening. The United States reminded the world today that catching Osama bin Laden is what it's in Afghanistan for. The Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld made it clear he's not interested in negotiating any deals that will allow his Al-Qaeda terrorist mercenaries to leave Afghanistan or provide an escape route for the Taliban leader, Mullah Omar. As he spoke, American warplanes continued to rain destruction on the last 2 strongholds still in Taliban hands. Thousands of Taliban are trapped in the northernmost one, Kunduz, surrounded by troops of the Northern Alliance. The embattled Taliban fighters, many of them foreigners, are reported to be willing to surrender, but only if their safety is guaranteed. John Sobel sent this report from the front line outside the city.
The Northern Alliance are now throwing and launching everything they have in their armoury to persuade the Taliban to surrender the city of Kunduz. But so far they're only coming over in dribs and drabs. This defector, whom I met this afternoon, seemed happy, almost deliriously so, to have escaped their clutches. They're cruel, he says. They've been killing people in Kunduz and beating them. So we're now the enemy of the Taliban, and we'll fight against them.
And that's why you've left the Taliban?
We saw today from this hilltop tank position the scale of the problem the Northern Alliance face in convincing the other 20,000 Taliban fighters to lay down their arms. Kunduz is still over 20 miles away and they're making slow progress. And so American warplanes return today with a vengeance. This is the 4th consecutive day of bombing of Taliban positions around the city of Kunduz, and it may be that it's having its effect. For the first time, there is talk of a negotiated surrender by the Taliban forces. But Northern Alliance soldiers are rejecting the Taliban demand that their foreign fighters, said to number several thousand, should be escorted out of the country by the UN.
They're terrorists. Foreigners fighting in Afghanistan. They can't possibly be allowed to surrender to the UN.
And so the Northern Alliance may be left with only one option, fighting their way into Kunduz. A military encounter that could be as bloody as anything that Afghanistan has witnessed in its recent turbulent history. John Sopel, BBC News, Northern Afghanistan.
Tribal groups in southern Afghanistan say they're continuing to negotiate with the Taliban over the future of the other key city, Kandahar. thousands of people have fled the city, which remains nonetheless under Taliban control. Matt Fry is one of the few Western journalists in Kandahar province. He's just sent this report from Spin Buldak.
No liberation here, no hostility either, just astonishment at the sight of foreigners. These were the crowds who met us as we drove into the last chunk of Taliban territory. We weren't allowed to film, so these fleeting glimpses will have to do, but they speak volumes. This is the Taliban's proud heartland, but the miserable houses on the main shopping street are disused containers. Here the movement was born only 7 years ago, and here the Taliban is making its last stand. We saw anti-aircraft guns, but they're covered in blankets, useless against the American bombers well out of range and expected to pound the earth for another night. The road to Kandahar, it sounds beguiling, but it's lined with human misery. This is the refugee crisis which the world hasn't seen yet. Thousands of tents stretching into the desert as far as the eye can see. The occupants are Afghan families who escaped drought, bombing, and now the threat of more civil war, unable to cross into the relative comfort of Pakistan. Also lining the road, thousands of oil drums, fuel for the war effort perhaps. There was much to see, and so little time to see it. Our escort drove us as fast as they could to a secure compound. We've been locked in for the night. We're not allowed to film anything, and people are extremely edgy here, not least because this is the birthplace of the Taliban. It is here in this town that the movement was founded 7 years ago. It is here that it's probably all going to end. But so far at least, the Taliban still seem to be in charge. Darkness and the Taliban look like our protectors and jailers. They were fascinated by the spectacle of television, still banned here. The war may soon be over, but the clash of cultures and the culture of mistrust will not. Matt Fry, BBC News, inside Taliban-controlled Afghanistan.
Well, for more on the attitude of the Pentagon to negotiating surrender deals under which Taliban leaders would escape, Gavin Hewitt joins us from Washington. Gavin, what was Donald Rumsfeld saying today? Was he saying that the Northern Alliance could do what they like with the Taliban and the hated foreigners, and America will let them get on with it?
Well, what he was really saying was, as far as America's concerned, it's going to take a pretty hard and uncompromising line about these negotiations on the ground. Firstly, in Kandahar, the Americans won't knowingly allow the Taliban leader, Mullah Mohammed Omar, to leave the city. And the Americans will use their influence, and by that I think they mean their military power, to prevent that happening. And then the Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters in Kunduz, the Americans don't want them leaving with their weapons. And once again, I think they'll use their power to prevent that. And the reason is that they fear that some of these people will regroup and that the Al-Qaeda network might prosper elsewhere. Peter.
Gavin Hewitt, thank you. A town in central Afghanistan, which is now under the control of anti-Taliban forces, is still being attacked by American aircraft. The area around Gardez, 100 miles southeast of Kabul, has been hit repeatedly despite a withdrawal by Taliban forces several days ago. In the latest bombing, a building used by a United Nations mine clearance agency was hit, killing 4 people. Raghi Omar reports from Gardez.
They may have Kabul, but this is as far as the Northern Alliance's control runs. Till now, it's been too dangerous to travel beyond this point as Taliban forces retreated. But the region south of here is now in the hands of different tribal commanders who, whilst distrusting the Northern Alliance, are still fiercely anti-Taliban. We followed the route used by the fleeing army as they withdrew from Kabul. We'd barely arrived when this car pulled up, carrying a survivor from an American bombardment which took place only hours before. Dozens of men came up to us, desperate to speak. They said they couldn't understand why this was happening.
Taliban forces in this area, could they be trying to target Taliban forces?
This man told me the Taliban had gone long ago. We're in control now, he said, so why are our innocent people still being killed by the planes? 2 days ago, 6 people, including 3 teenage girls, died in this house during nighttime bombing. Still shaking from the shock, Haji Ghulam Hussein showed me the remains of the missile which has destroyed his family. It was clearly marked as an American-made missile. This garrison, a former UN demining camp, was abandoned by the Taliban nearly a week ago, and it was being used as a refuge by a displaced family from Kabul. But this morning it was bombed in the mistaken belief that Taliban fighters were still here. 4 people died, a tragic consequence of an intelligence failure that is now targeting the wrong people.
We've been told not to stay here for too long because of the possible risks of more US airstrikes. It's hard to understand why this bombing campaign is still continuing. The Taliban forces left this region several days ago, and yet the bombardment continues. And what's more, it's also claiming civilian casualties.
As the sun fell and the night closed in, we could see US planes again over this area. And people here just pray that the night won't bring more deaths. Raghi Omar, BBC News, Gardez, southern Afghanistan.
Downing Street has denied that the deployment of thousands of British troops in Afghanistan has been delayed because of opposition from Northern Alliance leaders in Kabul. On Friday, 100 British commandos arrived at the Bagram Air Base, north of the Afghan capital, and it was expected that thousands more would follow. Ben Brown reports from inside Bagram Air Base.
Bagram, a vast airbase near Kabul built by the Russians. Normally it's closed to reporters, but today we were allowed in to see it for ourselves. Bagram is now home to 160 American and British special forces. They're supposed to be an advanced guard. Britain has another 6,000 troops on 48-hour standby to come here. Part of their mission will be to secure the base, clear it of mines, and prepare it for humanitarian aid flights that will bring in relief supplies for the millions of Afghans in need of food and shelter this winter. But the Northern Alliance are in control around here, and at least one of their commanders has said the British are not welcome. There's been speculation that's why no more troops from Britain have yet arrived here. To iron out these tensions, American and British diplomats met senior officials of the Northern Alliance at talks inside the base. Stephen Evans, Britain's envoy to Afghanistan, denied there's any problem.
My understanding is that problem is sorted out.
Yeah, there wasn't any problem as such as it was reported by the media, and no problem about the presence of the British troops in Bagram Air Base.
But the meeting was about more than just Bagram. It was also about agreeing on a framework to end a quarter of a century of civil war here. The talks that have just been held amid the ruins of this airbase may turn out to be crucial for the political future of Afghanistan. What they've done is set out a roadmap, which, if it's followed, will create an interim administration representing the rival factions and pave the way for elections within 3 years. It may be this war-ravaged country's best chance of peace. But for now, there's still danger everywhere. Tonight, 4 journalists are feared dead. They were part of a convoy on the road from Jalalabad to Kabul, a route I travelled at the weekend. Gunmen ambushed them, took them away and shot them. Despite the dangers, British diplomatic staff have just arrived back in Afghanistan to reopen the embassy compound here for the first time in years. Afghanistan has long suffered from the interference of outsiders, but now it also needs their help. Ben Brown, BBC News, Kabul.
International negotiators are still trying to persuade Afghanistan's warring factions to meet to help shape a new government for the country. They want talks to be held this week, perhaps at a neutral location in Europe. James Robbins reports on those who'll be involved in deciding Afghanistan's future government and the different interests they represent.
The greatest single challenge facing the US-led coalition may not be finding bin Laden, but helping give the ordinary people of Afghanistan good government for a change. If that doesn't happen, the West will be charged with abandoning Afghanistan, leaving a wasteland behind. So how to involve Afghanistan's bitter rivals in power sharing? For starters, there are 4 substantial ethnic groupings to be reconciled. Within the Northern Alliance, the Tajiks are the dominant group, some 25% of the population. Their political leader, Burhanuddin Rabbani, is now the nearest thing Afghanistan has to a president. But he'll probably stand aside. He's hardly a unifying figure accused of atrocities while in power before the Taliban. Then there are the Uzbeks, some 8% of Afghanistan's people. They took the northern city of Mazar-e-Sharif under their military overlord, General Dostum. He also has a shocking human rights record. But without a slice of power for him, can Afghanistan be stable? The Hazaras need to be brought in too, some 19% of the population, as well as other smaller communities. But the biggest problem of all is the largest group of all, the Pashtuns, at least 40% of the people. They're gravely damaged because the Taliban are Pashtun, even if many Pashtun are not Taliban. Will the exiled king, himself a Pashtun, have real credibility at political peace talks? Can he help get enemies to work together? Given this Herculean task, some suspect the Americans are much keener on finding bin Laden. But Washington says no. Afghanistan must have power-sharing government too.
One that represents all geographical and ethnic backgrounds, one that will end Afghanistan's role as a haven for terrorists and drug dealers, one that will permit reconstruction and allow these millions of refugees to return home.
It's the United Nations which has to lead the search for those solutions, so the UN is desperate to bring the sides together soon. No one expects instant liberal democracy for Afghanistan. That would be totally unrealistic. The goal is probably a loose federal structure with as many warlords as possible sharing power and the money which always comes with it.
On the 31st of October, we broadcast a special report about the funding of Osama bin Laden's terrorist network Al-Qaeda and its links to the diamond trade. In the course of that report, we stated that frontmen for Osama bin Laden owned shares in an international mining company called Oryx Natural Resources. We also stated that Mohammed Khalfan, who is in jail for the 1998 bombings of the American embassies in Africa, was the same man as Mr. Kamal Khalfan, a shareholder in that company. We were wrong about both Oryx and Mr. Khalfan. Oryx Natural Resources is part of the Oryx Group, which has interests in banking, hotels and construction. Neither Oryx nor Mr. Khalfan has any connection with bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda network, or the American embassy bombings in Africa. One of its shareholders, His Excellency Kamal Khalfan, is a respected Omani businessman and an honorary consul of the Sultanate of Oman. He's not the convicted terrorist. We apologize unreservedly to Mr. Kamal Khalfan, Oryx Natural Resources, and its directors. The government's new anti-terrorism laws have been attacked by MPs from all sides of the Commons. One Labour backbencher described them as a ragbag of coercive measures. But the Home Secretary David Blunkett said they were a reasonable and proportionate response to the events of September the 11th.
Armed police guarding Westminster's routine now. These aren't ordinary times. And that's the Home Secretary's justification for detention without trial, phone bugging for evidence, all the powers he told the Commons he needs to take on the terrorists.
They have openly declared that it is open season on all of us in terms of organising to destroy our lives, our liberty, our values, and our way of life.
Most MPs went along with it, but not all. A vocal minority attacked the way a law they saw as oppressive was being rushed through Parliament.
And surely the Home Secretary accepts the historical precedence that when this House acts quickly, it seldom acts wisely.
Let them beware before they go ahead with this legislation, a ragbag of the most coercive measures that the best Mandarin minds from the Home Office can produce, and which will be manna from heaven for any future or indeed present Home Secretary who wishes to establish a police state.
David Blunkett didn't seem to mind a bit. He's no left-wing liberal, and though some Labour MPs are sceptical, others say detaining terrorist suspects is still kinder than deporting them to face death or torture. And as for the dissidents, who were they?
The yoghurt-eating, muesli-eating, Guardian-reading fraternity.
The Tories are backing the powers for now. They agreed with David Blunkett that the danger of terrorism meant there was no safe alternative.
And that's why, uniquely, or at any rate very exceptionally, I'm willing to accept the argument here that we should look at these things again later.
MPs have been voting, the result's not in doubt, but there'll be bitter arguments in coming days and far tougher resistance in the Lords. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
And we've just heard that the government has won the vote comfortably. The vote was 458 in favour, 5 against. And our political editor, Andrew Marr, is in Downing Street. Andrew, he got his second reading, but has this bill and the arguments against it and his responsibility for it, has it begun to take the shine off David Blunkett a bit?
Well, certainly as far as some of the people in the House of Commons who are listening today are concerned, he won the vote very, very easily. Hasn't necessarily won the argument, though. What we're seeing, I think, is the beginnings of something we haven't seen in the House of Commons for some years now, which is a genuine, vocal, self-confident opposition, not simply on the Conservative sides, but behind ministers. David Blunkett loves a fight. He got a fight today, but as John Pinar was saying in his report, this is the beginning of what's going to be quite a difficult period of days for the government, I think, period of weeks.
Now, I can't let you go without your thoughts on the latest outbreak of speculation about the uneasy relationship between the men who occupy the houses behind you, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Why is everybody suddenly talking about it again? Is it because it's possibly reaching breaking point?
Well, they're always talking about it as part of the answer. This has been going on, this uneasy relationship, for 7 years. There are another bout of speculation at the moment because there is a genuine argument about details of public spending and in due course about the euro too. But I think the fundamental truth is that even in a democracy these days, any government can only have one absolutely dominant character. And this one's got two of them. It's well described as a kind of political marriage. And the trouble is that it's a political marriage in which both partners are determined to wear the trousers.
Andrew Marr, thank you. The American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, has given details of a new diplomatic initiative to bring peace to the Middle East. Mr. Powell spoke of two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side within recognised borders. 2 American envoys will be going to the Middle East with the aim of bringing about a ceasefire and restarting negotiations. The mother of the murdered schoolgirl Sarah Payne has been recounting the moment she last saw her daughter alive. Giving evidence to Lewis Crown Court, Sarah Payne said she and her husband had left their 4 children playing and had told them to stay together. Roy Whiting from Littlehampton denies kidnapping and murdering the 8-year-old in July last year.
Today was the Payne's day in court. Sarah Payne pushing her elderly father in past the waiting media. She was to tell the jury of the last sight of her daughter Sarah one evening in July last year. The first witness in this case, Mrs. Payne, sat just a few feet from Roy Whiting, whose identity can't be shown. She spoke of the day Sarah vanished, the last meal of shepherd's pie, and her last words to Sarah and her brothers and sister as they went off to play in a field near Littlehampton. "Please stay together," she said. Mrs. Payne's recollections were followed by those of her 2 sons, seen here with the family at the height of the police search. In a recorded interview with detectives played to the court, Luke is heard asking, "When do you reckon we're going to get Sarah back?" His older brother Lee gave much of his evidence live in court through a video link, his words studied carefully by his parents and Roy Whiting. As Lee could also see the court, Mr. Justice Curtis and the barristers took off their wigs to calm his nerves. Lee then spoke of seeing Sarah disappear from the field they'd been playing in.
Speaking through that video link, Lee told the court that he came down this lane looking for his sister Sarah. When he got to this junction here at Peak Lane, he came across a white van with its wheels skidding, a suspicious van as he put it. He said it was driven by a scruffy man who waved and grinned at him before taking off back down that same lane.
Roy Whiting's mother, Pamela, in the blue coat, was among those today to hear Lee and the other family members relive their last contacts with Sarah. The Paynes themselves have finished giving their evidence, but will return again to hear this case unfold. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News, Lewis.
A businessman from Suffolk has been cleared of the murder of the teenager Vicky Hall. The jury at Norwich Crown Court took less than 90 minutes to find Adrian Bradshaw not guilty. This 17-year-old disappeared more than 2 years ago as she made her way home from a nightclub in Felixstowe. Her body was later found in a ditch 25 miles from her home. Francisco Archimontes, the man accused of murdering the Cornish schoolgirl Caroline Dickinson, is to be extradited from America to France to face trial. Montez has been handed over to American federal marshals in Miami. He's accused of raping and murdering the 13-year-old while she was on a school trip to France in 1996. A former police officer, Michelle Chu, who asked to have regular shifts so she could care for her young children, has won her 3-year sex discrimination battle. Avon and Somerset Police had refused her request, but last year lost its case in an employment tribunal and has now decided not to lodge a second appeal. A new survey has revealed huge regional differences in death rates after heart surgery. A patient's best chance of survival was in Bristol, and Walsgrave Hospital in Coventry had the worst record. Tonight, the government's Heart Supremo told the 10 o'clock news that patients could soon have access to individual surgeons' performance records.
Professor Gianni Angelini at work at Bristol Royal Infirmary today. If you need a heart bypass operation, this is the safest place to have one. The death rate is half the national average. Much has changed here since the early 90s and the scandal over poor results in children's heart surgery.
Most of the surgeons are new surgeons, and the same apply to a lot of other people. There have been changing in the way the surgery is conducted. So really, a lot of things have happened in the last 5 or 6 years.
In the past, patients were kept in the dark, one reason why mistakes went unchecked at this hospital. Now, across the country, surgical results for all sorts of operations are coming into the open. Now, these figures have to be treated with some caution, because the actual number of deaths is really quite small. So the difference between a very good hospital like this one and others lower down the table is not as great as it might seem. Nevertheless, we are moving towards a new era, an era in which we, the patients, will know much more about the performance of those who look after us. And that's hard if, like the Walsgrave Hospital, you're at the bottom of the table. The message here, things have improved, especially for bypass patients having routine operations.
Because of all the work that we've done in the past and the work that we're continuing to do now, their chances of survival are as good as any other unit in the country. For people having emergency surgery, we've been working to look and assess their risk better.
And more openness is on the way. Tonight, the government's so-called Heart Czar said patients should soon have access not just to hospital data, but also to the performance of individual surgeons.
It may take 2 or 3 years for enough data to accrue about an individual surgeon's performance before it becomes meaningful. So that's what we're working on at the moment.
There are dangers, not least that doctors could avoid more difficult cases, but most now agree an open system will be a better one. Neil Dixon, BBC News.
It's 26.5 minutes past 10. I'll be back a little later with an update on the day's headlines, but now we join our news teams across the United Kingdom.
Good evening, I'm Kim Riley. Tonight, the man accused of killing Suffolk teenager Vicky Hall is free after being held in prison for 11 months. On the 12th day of his trial, it took the jury 90 minutes to find Adrian Bradshaw not guilty of murder. Adrian Bradshaw arrived by prison van on this his last morning in custody. More than 2 years after their beloved Victoria was taken from them, the judge paid tribute to the enormous dignity shown by the Hall family. This was the final image of Vicky leaving the Bandbox nightclub with her best friend Gemma in the early hours of Sunday the 19th of September 1999. After walking the 3 miles home, the girls separated a short distance from their homes at Trimley St Mary. 5 days later, Vicky's naked body was found in a stream 25 miles away. Key to the prosecution case was that mud found in Adrian Bradshaw's Porsche matched soil samples taken here. But after 11 days of evidence, the jury returned very swiftly with a unanimous verdict, not guilty.
I was arrested in May 2000 and I would describe it as my life collapsing overnight. Jail's tough if you've been accused of a terrible, heinous crime like I have, but I just kept faith in myself, my legal team and my innocence, and that's what kept me going.
When they find someone guilty or not guilty, it doesn't alter the fact that Victoria's not with us anymore. So, in that sense, our feelings haven't changed at all.
Vicky's murder led to a huge police operation. At its height, there were 100 officers working on the case, following up 12,000 lines of inquiry.
I'm very, very disappointed with the verdict. Our job is to obtain as much evidence as we possibly can and place it before the court. I believe in this case we've done that, and it's for the court to make of it what they wish.
The attacker will never know how much pain he has caused Vicky's family and friends, and will never feel as terrified as Vicky probably felt that night. The last 2 years have been very up and down emotionally for me, as I've tried to get my head around what has happened. I've had so much support from my family and friends and the police, and I'd like to thank them all. I hope one day someone will own up to their actions and be able to provide us with some sort of explanation as to why they murdered Vicky when she had her whole life ahead of her.
I feel that we've got to live with what happened to Victoria the rest of our lives, and I still feel whether the murderer is convicted or not, he's still got to live with it as well.
Tonight, Suffolk police say they will review their investigation in the light of the jury verdict and pledged any new leads will be fully investigated. Adrian Bradshaw left court on the arms of his mother and sister, who never doubted his innocence.
And BBC Radio Suffolk have a special documentary reviewing the Vicky Hall case and the hunt for her killer. That's at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. There are hopes tonight that 12 British plane spotters being held in a Greek jail on spying charges may be released tomorrow. Among the group are Paul and Leslie Coppin from Suffolk, who also organised the trip. From Greece, our Home Affairs correspondent Sally Chidzoy reports.
It's been described as the second most secure prison in Greece. Nafplion Jail is 150 kilometres southwest of Athens. It holds 400 inmates. The British men are here while Paul Coppin's wife Leslie is in a women's jail in Athens. This morning the governor invited me inside the prison. Off camera he told me the group were being treated the same as Greek prisoners. They had been strip searched and they're being held with local low-risk prisoners 4 to a cell.
The governor was half expecting to receive instructions today authorising him to release the prisoners, but it was not meant to be.